Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are, of course. Before we start, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge that this land was never ceded or sold and was taken just like that. We also recognise their elders past, present and emerging, their customs and traditions, their ownership of land and water. Okay, today we are going to have a round table on the two sessions which have just been completed in Beijing, the meeting of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Professor Edwards, Louise Edwards, who is our standard chair and moderator on these occasions. It's great pleasure to do that. And she will introduce you to everybody else. But before I do that, can I say, if you would like to ask a question in the course of the roundtable, that can be answered later. Please put those questions into the Q&A, question and answer session at the bottom of your Zoom page. And then Louise will be able to select them from there and posit them on your behalf to either all or any named individuals in the roundtable. My job is done. I hand over to Professor Edwards. Thank you all very much. And thank you to the participants as well.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I too am coming to you from the lands of Indigenous people, colonised people, from the lands of the Whakatohia tribe in the Eastern Bay of Plenty of New Zealand, where I'm now visiting family. Gives me great pleasure to host this this event. We have three outstanding speakers, very knowledgeable people on Chinese domestic and domestic politics and the way that the domestic politics interacts with the international. Just going across the top of my screen, we have Michael Murphree from the University of Sydney, Minglu Chen from University of Sydney, and Tony Saich from Harvard University. Their biographies, full biographies, were on the invitation that you would have received, and I don't want to spend valuable time reading through all of their immense achievements, because I think one of the reasons that you're all here today is because you know of their immense achievements and would like to hear what they have to say about the two sessions. As David said, the two sessions are the moment in the year where the key leaders in China look backwards on what's happened and look forwards to where they're going and check themselves against the plans that they've set up. And this year, a number of this year perhaps appeared less dramatic than in previous years, because there were so many dramatic things happening all around the rest of the world. So, but let's not preempt what our speakers are going to say. So first, I'd like to start with you, Michael, and just if you can help us set the scene for where the two sessions fit into overall domestic policy making in China. So people will have heard of the 5-year plans that have been central to the Chinese political system for decades. So what's the role of the 5-year plans in a non-centrally planned economy? Now, I'm assuming here, when you prompted me to ask you this question in our discussion, that you're talking about now our current era as being non-centrally planned, where, say, the 50s, 60s and 70s was very much centrally planned. So why are they still doing 5-year plans, and how does it connect to this more hands-off approach? And then a second question, just so that I don't interrupt you, would be, how do these 5-year plans connect to the more well-advertised initiatives like Made in China 2025 or China Standards 2030? These are things that perhaps current day audiences and China people who interact with China find more relatable, because they connect very well with what's going on in other parts of the world, different well-advertised programs that are promoted to business and government. So how do the 5-year plans connect to these more modern style of public policy planning?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you especially to the China Studies Center for organizing this roundtable. It is an honor to be here with such illustrious colleagues, those with far greater pedigrees than myself. But thank you for these opening questions. And to just sort of very briefly put it in perspective, ever since I began studying the development of economies in East Asia, particularly in China, the question of economic planning has come up. And so, as everyone knows, if you go back to 1928 in the Soviet Union, under Stalin, they were trying to figure out what did it mean to promote an economy when you're not a capitalist? How do you actually do that? And so they, through various trials and errors, and especially after the death of Lenin, they came to this idea of the 5-year plan. And in effect, a comprehensively planned economy, what you do is you start with your end goals, where you want to be in 5 years. And it's not just general objectives, it's specifically how many railroad cars, how much rolling stock, how many miles of track, how many new roads will be laid, how many kilowatts of power will be generated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you back calculate through the entire economy what every factory, every town, every work unit has to produce, and how many new factories, towns, and work units need to be invested in order to achieve these outputs. And that's what China did, borrowing from the Soviets from 1953 fully until 1980. At which point, as we all know, we were then into the era of opening and reform. And then it became a great debate within China over what is the role of planning when we're trying to also promote a market economy. And Deng Xiaoping's approach to it was very simple, which is, well, planning for socialism or planning for a market, planning is used in both economies. And the examples he drew upon were actually China's great economic competitors in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and the Republic of China on Taiwan, which all of 3 of which had planning bureaus and engaged in economic planning. The difference is that in these market economies, you have what we would call, or what Chalmers Johnson, the scholar of Japan, had called a plan rational versus plan political economy. In a plan rational economy, you don't give specific output targets, how many miles of railroad to build, but you do specifically target which industry and the structure of that industry that you want to use. And rather than mandating the specific ordering of goods, how many pieces to be produced by whom and sent to where, you then use subsidies, tax breaks, political loans, or government procurement, as well as targeted use of protectionist tariffs or import restrictions to build the economy in the vision that you want. But one of the main goals is that as you're promoting all of this, you're always doing it with an eye towards exports. It's very much oriented towards building an economy that is open to the world and competitive with the rest of the world. Whereas the plan political, the old plan, was explicitly domestically oriented with only a very insignificant focus on what you would do with any sort of external engagement. Indeed, external engagement is to be kept to a minimum as much as possible in traditional planning. So that all being said, so what is the role of the plan? It is where the leadership in Beijing says, this is where we want our overall economic structure to be in 5 years in order to be globally competitive, not just developed and economically strong, but globally competitive. And this is where we then get into how does this fit with, thank you for calling into this directly, Louise, these other well-announced plans like Made in China 2025, back in 2006, when I started doing research, the mid to long range plan for science and technology development, that was a 15-year plan, as well as the China Standards 2030 plan. So if you think about it this way, the 5-year plans are sort of like laws in Western market democracies, where you have a law that is set by your legislature, and then you have regulations and policies which are used to actually implement that. So these longer term programs, your Made in China 2025, your China Standards 2030, are the specific implementation approaches to realize the objectives of these 5-year plans. And they're actually stretching out further, so they go across 2-3 different plans in order to achieve their set goals. It just so happens that Made in China 2025 lines up perfectly with the end of the 14th 5-year plan. So they actually lined up, but this doesn't usually happen, but it does in this particular case. Although interestingly, Made in China, or China Standards 2030 also lines up with the end of the next the 15th 5-year plan. So how has the performance of all of them been in terms of realizing the goals of these plans? And so if we look at the most recent economic plan, we know that there's been a pretty standard desire to keep economic growth at or around about 5%, which has been steadily tracking down over the last decade. We all remember, of course, back in the 2000s, where they said if growth drops below 8%, there will be riots in the street. Now, of course, they say if we can get 5%, everything will be fine. So you can see how the objectives have become more rational in terms of their expectations, but we still hit them every year, one way or the other. And we can discuss that in the Q&A, what it actually means to hit the growth target set by the plan, which is a separate issue. But in terms of the technology performance and how this relates to Made in China 2025, as well as the 14th five-year plan, there has been great success in some areas. So in 5G, Huawei and ZTE, but Huawei in particular, are leading providers of these hardcore technologies, as well as contributors of the standards essential patents. They've been leaders in solar cell technology, electric vehicles. The goals for achieving self-sufficiency in semiconductors have not been met. There has been some well-publicized breakthroughs in using older generation production technology to produce much more current generation chips, but this is done at a great expense of production quantity and quality in order to achieve a smaller output. So they have not achieved the goals that they have met. And last year, there was a wide amount of publicity about there being quite a bit of consternation in Beijing over the tens of billions of dollars invested in semiconductors, but China is not yet able to produce cutting-edge chips of its own without relying on roundabout ways of getting it from overseas. Relatedly, they have actually maintained a very complete production base, which is something that the Made in China 2025 has emphasized. They seek 70% self-sufficiency in all areas of manufacturing. They're not there yet, but in terms of keeping everything from low-end manufacturing up through the most cutting edge, they have successfully done that, which contributes to its $1 trillion trade surplus last year. Effectively, that they produce a little bit of everything across all stages of production. So this has been successful, at least in terms of realizing that goal. They have also been very successful in diversifying the knowledge base of the country so that it's not just Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, but also now cities like Hefei, Wuhan, and Chengdu are now major centers of knowledge and innovation. So spreading the growth and spreading the industrial base, which is beneficial because you don't want to end up in a situation like my home country, the United States, where if something bad happens in Silicon Valley or New York, it can cause great damage to the economy more broadly because there's so much concentration in the economy in certain sectors. Now, finally, looking to where are they going? It's going to be a very interesting question of whether or not the next five-year plan will be as successful, arguably, as the previous one was in terms of maintaining this broader technology base. Mostly because if you look at this year's Yanghui, this year's dual meetings, they don't talk a whole lot about the greater headwinds. They make broad reference to rising protectionism and rising geopolitical tensions. But in terms of how that will actually change their policies, I just didn't see that very much. And this surprised me greatly with the approach to planning under this year's two meetings, is that it's basically all is still good. Keep calm and carry on. The five-year plans are working well. Our plans are doing okay. Yes, there are some headwinds, but it's full steam ahead. We're continuing as before, business as usual. And that's very interesting to me as an expression of confidence that they believe their system is working and that the headwinds will be no obstacle. Or alternately, it's a question of we're trying to avoid investor panic. And so we're trying to create a perception of strength. And next year, when the next five-year plan comes out, then we will see much greater emphasis on how to achieve these self-sufficiencies in areas they have not yet been successful.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, it seems it seems like they want to hold steady to the plan and the goals and the directions that they're taking, despite the buffets that come from outside. And that seems almost to be what happened during COVID, right? There was COVID was a huge hit to the Chinese economy and the global economy, but they sort of still held that the plans were actually the guiding force through even through the headwinds. And I think that's kind of like interesting in terms of like comparisons of electoral politics, where we often see governments changing and then dropping good policies, but just because the opposition had them or the previous government had them. And it's kind of like citizens are sitting there with their head in their hands saying, but that was a good idea. Why are we dropping that one? That absence of a long-term goal can often be frustrating for people in democracies. And it's interesting to hear you say that even with the headwinds, they're still holding these holding the course, or at least presenting the impression of holding the course. Yeah. Even if they don't achieve it.
Yes.
Yeah, Tony, can I turn to you now and ask you what stood out for you with the meetings? How does it connect to the big December meetings of the Central Economic Work Conference? What's the connection between the December meetings and these March ones?
Well, I think it goes back to the theme that you just stressed of continuity. There really was not a shock. Before getting on to that, though, I want to make a couple of other points about 5-year plans. And one of the first things, again, relates to this question of continuity. The rhythm and the structuring of the 5-year plan is always such that it will overlap with a leadership change. And that was always done quite coherently, although, of course, under Xi Jinping, we're not getting a leadership change. But it was always the idea that there would be 2 or 3 years after a new leadership came in that would be bound to the previous plan before they began to structure and set up their own developmental approach. I mean, I think secondly, they're very important signals for local leaders. You'll see a rush, and you're going to see it moving forward. I mean, every province now is going to invest in AI clusters and a whole bunch of things, which is going to lead to tremendous waste of investment at the local levels. We know with these provincial government guidance funds, they've all rushed to the same areas for investment, a lot of duplication and a fair amount of waste. Perhaps one of the most striking comments I got about a 5-year plan when I asked the local official, what was their expectation for the GDP growth rate? He just said to me, "Oh, what a dumb question." And I looked at him perplexed. He said, "It's whatever the parties told us it's going to be. And if they told us it's 5%, it's going to be 5% growth. So that's pretty obvious." Anyway, bringing it back to the two meetings, I think it's quite extraordinary. If you think about the tumultuous situation of everything that's going on around the world with what President Trump is introducing with tariffs, other measures, conflict with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the issue in Israel and Gaza. I think the most striking thing about the two meetings, in addition to continuity, was actually the rather calm, measured response that the leadership put forward. They didn't sound panicked. They didn't sound rushed to make decisions. And there were no truly dramatic announcements of anything especially new. Li Qiang, the premier, rehearsed the well-known challenges, the unpredictable international environment, local government debt, housing markets, youth unemployment. They proposed a few measures trying to get to grips with these. I don't think any of the measures proposed are actually going to resolve the challenges that he outlined. There was a promise of 4.5 trillion renminbi for local government special purpose bonds to invest in infrastructure. And that's also, of course, trying to drive the 5% growth target, because local governments are cash strapped. And this is one way to try and incentivize them to get the growth rates up to the 5%. With the worries about youth unemployment, they said they wanted to create 12 million new urban jobs. Again, whether it will be enough, we'll see. And as Michael said, there's the 5% growth target. I think my view is that they're actually going to struggle to meet that target, given both some of the domestic headwinds, which they mentioned, but also given the international environment around them, which is going to make their capacity for the export markets a little more challenging, a little more problematic. As you mentioned, Louise, essentially the most important meeting, I think, has now become the Central Economic Work Conference, which is always held at the end of the calendar year, which again reviews what has happened and begins to outline what are they going to do in the next year. And that really focused very clearly on Xi Jinping's desire to focus on what he calls high quality development, the kind of technological areas that Michael was just talking about. And that is the way he sees as driving the economy forward, both for domestic concerns, but also to reduce reliance on foreign technologies, and looking at the possible fears of what might happen with responses from the West to China's continued development there. There was a nod to the private sector, which perhaps we can come back to. The chair of the MPC talked about moving their way along for a new law which will provide guarantees and protections for the private sector and in an enhanced environment for them. And similarly, there was mention of the need to improve consumption. But I think underpinning all of it, though, it's quite clear that the top priority is and remains the high quality development. And that really the shift to a consumer-driven economy, which many economists within China have been pushing for quite some time now, remains a long-term project, and also requires political shifts and changes, which I think would be difficult for the leadership to contemplate. Maybe just one last comment, and perhaps we can come back to a couple of these issues of private sector consumption and so forth, is I think Xi Jinping's focus on the high quality development, I think, is going to set two sets of problems for China, maybe more. The domestic problem is, what are you going to do with the 800 or 900 million people or 1 billion people who can't compete in that economy? Yeah. Most of the people are in the gig economy or in the informal economy. And one saw very little, either at the work conference or at the two meetings, that really addressed the concerns of what do you do about those people. So you're really going to have a very marginalized and extensive set of your population that's not going to be able to compete in a high quality environment. I think last thing is it's also going to set some issues related to exports, because that focus on that high quality development means that China is going to produce overcapacity in those kinds of areas, in green technologies, et cetera, which will then be exported. And of course, are already setting off alarm bells in a number of countries. The EU put tariffs on electric vehicles. I saw in Thailand something like 170 factories closed because of the flood of Chinese goods that were coming in. So it's also, I think, going to create frictions with many of China's neighbors. So not a lot was new. I don't think a lot was in there that's going to resolve those challenges, even though the leadership acknowledges them. And perhaps, as Michael says, it's just brush them off and no, we're okay. We can keep going the way we're going. It'll all be all right.
Yeah, okay. Is the desire to say it'll all be all right and tamp down any anxieties part of that process of trying to build domestic confidence so that domestic consumption can go up? If the external world is going to be problematic for Chinese exports, are they, trying to drive the economy from within with the domestic market, which is a huge market? Is that a possible switch?
It's a possible switch, but not a probable switch. I mean, I don't want to stress too strongly. I mean, consumption has been rising. And as you said, it's a pretty formidable market. And of course, one of the things they've done with their tech businesses is, they've brought a lot of it back to China. And what you offer to those who studied abroad and set up their tech startups is you give them the promise of 1.4 billion consumers, and then you seal them off to international competition. Well, who can't make money under the circumstances? But I think really the shift to a household consumption-driven strategy is still a long way away. I mean, it's true that on March 16, the Central Committee and the State Council did put forward what they saw as their action plan for boosting consumption. And it contains many enticing and attractive elements in it, increasing pensions, childcare, looking after the elderly, and so on and so forth, and many measures to encourage spending beyond that, including this trade-in plan that they talk about, expanding the trade-in scheme that they put forward a while ago. However, the problem is neither the National People's Congress nor that document provides any notion about funding. And then the challenge comes, who's going to fund it? Well, enterprises and local governments. And of course, we know local governments are already cash strapped. And in fact, there is one sentence somewhere that sort of says that those local governments that are more, I suppose, profitable can actually start picking up some of these things. But it means that for most of the local governments, they're simply not going to be able to provide the funding to cover these very extensive plans for consumption. So I think, basically mercantilism of the leadership and its focus on industrial policy, particularly high tech and exports, is going to rule the day over household-based consumption-driven economics.
Yeah, okay, very interesting. And another thing I'd like to tease out if I can, you said a very, made the alluring comment about some of the policies the leadership would find unpalatable. Do you remember saying that? And I was wondering if you could tease out what sort of changes you think would be unpalatable to the leadership. Do they relate to welfare provision or?
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese leadership have always been very reticent to develop what they would think of as a welfare state. They're very concerned, to invest too much in terms of minimum living support, pensions, even the insurance schemes don't really cover, some of the basic medical costs that would be necessary. The costs around education, for example, mean that people hoard money rather than spending it. And that's been a continuous problem. And they really haven't shifted to true incentives that could push that out and push the money out. And I think, the central government has the money, and but the burden falls on the local government, and the local government doesn't have the money. And so you can't really drive kind of consumer spending in the way they would want under those circumstances. Last thing I just say on that, there's a very strong political issue that if you were to do this, you would be redirecting money from state investment into investing in ways that would increase money within the households. And I think that to the Communist Party is politically unacceptable. Wow. Their focus is a state-driven economy, the high-tech development, and they don't want to be deflected from that.
Wow, that's really interesting. Michael, can I return to you now and invite you to tell us a bit more about the technological advances that Tony was referring to in terms of high quality development, and its technological advance has been crucial to China's economic prosperity and its global impact in the first decades of the 21st century. So can you tell us what you think the impact of the plans has been, the 5-year plans has been in terms of that technology and innovation?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And thank you, Tony, for that extensive political side of the perspective on the issue of planning and performance. So in terms of the actual performance, it's always a very big question, which people have debated and scholars get into, verbal fistfights over at every China conference I attend. To what degree has China's overall economic performance, but also its technological performance since 1978 been smart and sensible planning step by step? And what percentage been everything the government did was a waste of money, and their success has been completely in spite of everything that they did? By basically you free up a billion people to go and do business, they're going to yield a lot of economic performance. I mean, that's sort of this debate. I don't fall on the perspective that, we should attribute all success to the state and to the plans, because oftentimes, especially in the last 15 years, some of the areas that have been most successful have also been areas that grew up alongside or outside of the plan. So some of China's leading auto companies, including some of its leaders in EVs, naturally, they were not supposed to be car manufacturers. They were not supposed to be industry leaders. They just started doing it. Similarly, Huawei, the most famous Chinese technology company of all, was to use an expression, it was the unloved child until it became successful. And then belatedly, the government turned around and said, oh, this company is actually dominating the domestic telecommunications hardware provision sector. Okay, now we're going to start supporting this company actively. So in many cases, it has been private or semi-private or locally state-owned companies that have found niches alongside the plan where this is where the government wants to go. So there will be promotion of this sector, even though I'm not specifically a target of that promotion, and I'm going to capitalize on that. So perhaps we could argue the plans give a direction and they give a signal in the market that would-be entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial local governments can then jump into and have been very successful in that. After the fact, then the central government often latches onto these firms, and then they become the beneficiaries of targeted policy loans and other incentive policies, government procurement, promotion of their overseas activities, et cetera. But it sometimes and often is after the fact. The challenge, I think, is that in many cases, particularly in sectors like semiconductors, where the government is still trying to promote a catch-up and self-sufficiency plan, the problem with catching up is that if the frontier continues to move, are you always catching up to a moving target? And in many cases, especially with semiconductors and the like, the frontier is moving faster than they're catching up. And this is particularly true in the area that normally China does exceptionally well, which is in the production and scale adaptation of innovations. But domestic companies like SMIC, despite all of the promotion that they've received, are still multiple generations behind TSMC, the global leader. And the technology is moving so fast that they're actually falling behind. They're not actually catching up, they're actually falling further behind. And this has been at great expense. A number of years ago, it was argued that I was at a meeting in Beijing in 2016, where they were talking about memory chips, so DRAM chips. And the argument was, well, China wants to capture this sector the same way that the Taiwanese captured it, or the same way that Korea captured it from Japan, who had captured it from the United States. And the warning was given, yeah, Taiwan tried this and they spent billions of dollars and they didn't succeed. Odds are you're going to invest $100 billion and you will have nothing to show for it because of the way that these markets have changed. And in some cases, this is the downside of planning, is come hell or high water, they're going to put the money into these sectors. And sometimes it just is that the movement is going beyond what the plan is actually able to keep up with, because a plan is a static target, whereas this is a dynamic moving sector. That being said, in terms of being able to shift funding and support into areas that are surprisingly successful, that are within the broader outlines of the plan, it's very effective.
Fascinating. So it's there's the kind of long-term planning in an environment or in a sector of the economy that is moving so rapidly can actually not reap the benefits that perhaps a leadership group would anticipate that it would. You know, that there could have just be an enormous waste of money. But well, watch this space. I think that's really going to be fast moving. And if we stay on the topic of technology, can I come back to you, Tony, and ask you about the topic you alluded to in your previous discussion about how the government connects to the private sector, and you know, what's if you want, you know, what's Xi Jinping's relationship with the tech dagu, you know, the tech bros in China? You know, how are they trying to achieve what Michael has just outlined is a pretty tough ask?
Well, I think the game changer was DeepSeek. If we know, I mean, historically, the Chinese Communist Party has always been rather ambivalent in terms of its attitude towards the private sector. Of course, when it was established in 1921, it saw no role for the private sector. And after 1949, it's really only cozied up to the private or the non-state sector of the economy when the economics have been in trouble, or when it's really needed a boost to it. And of course, we know, going back just a few years, when you know, Jack Ma from Alibaba was ostracized because of comments he made about regulators. Alibaba got into trouble, the IPO was banned, and things look very dark and gloomy for the tech bros, as you refer to them, and to the private sector more generally. And as I said, then it came along DeepSeek. And if I was Xi Jinping sitting in my office, well, it'd suddenly be a wake-up moment. Oh my goodness, you know, the private sector really can offer something to what I want to achieve. And then we see, you know, starting in the fall, in December, this feelers being put out towards the private sector saying, you know, we value you. We want you to be able to compete in the same way as the state-owned sector. We want you to be able to access funding. And then, of course, in February, there was the sit down with a number of those tech leaders, really to try and signal it's okay. You know, we want you to help me meet my dream. But of course, that's, I think, the key point. It's Xi Jinping's dream. And in that sense, that part of the tech sector is really only being brought in to meet the party's goals, to meet this high quality demands which he's laying forward. The question then, I think, becomes twofold. The first is, will that kind of constrain spontaneity of tech development because they're now pretty much being mandated or encouraged to meet the objectives that the party wants from it? And the second thing, though, goes back to the political economy. Can you really sort of shift the decades of priority for lending, for investment, for the culture even, that has always favored the state-owned sector? And I think when proverbial push comes to shove, in Xi Jinping's mind, it's still the state-owned sector that is really going to drive this forward. That's the most reliable vehicle. And the private sector is now coming in as an interesting partner that can be pushed towards helping meet those objectives. So clearly Xi wants them to help him meet his objectives. We saw Zhao Leji, chair of the National People's Congress, again emphasizing that there will be a law coming into play which will announce a more level playing ground, that private sector will be dealt with the same way as the state sector. I don't know how many times I've heard that over the last 20 or 30 years, and we just have to see how long that lasts and how it really works out in practice. You know, those tech bros, as you refer to them, you know, if Xi Jinping says, come and sit in the front row with me, you're going to turn up. You know, how close do you really want to be? Is it going to sort of dampen the kind of creativity they've shown? Can it really be harnessed to meet the party's goals? Will there still be the kind of residual sentiments against private sector? I think particularly when you get down to the local level, it's going to become a problem. So again, I think it's like many of these things, we're just going to have to see, not over 2 weeks of a National People's Congress meeting, but over 2 or 3 years, whether we're still looking at an improving environment for the private sector.
And tell me, you mentioned that they were looking at 12 million jobs for youth over the next little while. And are they expecting the tech sector to be the drivers of that kind of employment opportunity, or?
Well, they're talking about urban jobs. I mean, not necessarily specific towards the youth sector. I mean, I think it goes back to the point I made earlier. Perhaps they're concerned, they would be more concerned, I would think, with the graduates coming out of universities and colleges if they cannot find jobs and becoming frustrated. But as I said, that's not where hundreds of millions of people and young people find their employment. It's the informal economy, it's the gig economy. And there's been no clear indications of how they're going to deal effectively with those sectors of the economy. And I think you're going to finish up with a bifurcated society, those who can compete in the, you know, high quality development stakes, and those who are going to be rushing around on their mopeds delivering food and all the other kind of services where they're open to quite exploitative measures.
Yeah, Michael, you were shaking your head at one point in response to my question. I'd love to hear what you're going to contribute.
I just wanted to add very briefly that I completely agree with a lot of what Tony is saying in this. And what struck me was his final point, and this is where I wanted to again make a broader parallel, is your description of a bifurcated economy between those who are in the strong, technologically progressive, and well-remunerated formal sector, quality sector, and everybody else. This is akin to what actually happens in Japan, where the traditional image of Japan as the land of the great salaryman and lifetime employment and all of this, that system worked for 20% of the workforce. And it was based on 80% of the workforce being in highly flexible, uncertain, often under remunerated positions. And that's what enabled Toyota and the others to give these lifetime employment contracts and the steady development and that sort of thing. So again, that may be a stable model. Japan has managed to maintain stability without growth for 30 years. So that may be a vision, but I don't think that's the intended outcome of these plans or technological proposals.
Wow. Gosh. Okay. Now I want to move a sort of a bit of a gear change to ask Minglu. They mentioned in the two sessions some programs for women. So from tech bros to women, where are we, where do women fit into the, this new high quality economy? And what do you think is going on that they're raising the question of women?
Thank you so much, Louise, for asking this question. I've been paying attention to the two sessions this year, as I always do. And this year, I'm a bit surprised that the issue of women's rights have not really caught a lot of media attention. Although actually something quite significant happened on the 6th of March, which was 2 days before the International Women's Day, where Wang Yi, the member of Politburo and China's foreign minister, actually said in a two-session media press that one of China's key tasks in the coming months was China is going to convene, which is a Xi Jinping proposal actually. China is going to convene or host a global summit on gender equality and women's empowerment in Beijing. So this is because this is what I research on. So it has immediately caught my attention that I didn't see anybody discussing this, that I looked up this issue in greater details, right? So there actually seems at the surface, this would be a strong commitment from the Communist Party, or actually the two sessions is really the government playing field to advance women's rights. However, I find it really unexpected that Wang Yi initiated this idea. And elsewhere in the two sessions, I think this year, the government actually sends a very conflicting message. I think everything else I have read suggests that women's rights and gender equality is currently not a priority of the Chinese state's policy making. So some reasons. First, the Chinese media reported Xi Jinping visited female delegates of the National People's Congress and female representative of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference to congratulate them and wish them a happy International Women's Day, because that was the 8th of March this year. All he had to say was, have a happy festival, and here are my best wishes. That's it. There was nothing about any concrete plan or any mention of any plan to empower women and advance women's rights. So that's conflicting message number one. Conflicting message number two is in this very lengthy document that Premier Li Qiang delivered in the two sessions, the Chinese government work report, which I don't know if people have counted the words, is an 18,000 word document in which there was one sentence of 16 words, 16 characters in Chinese devoted to the issue of women. In Chinese, it is 保障妇女、儿童、老年人、残疾人合法权益, translating into protect the lawful rights and interests of women, but not just women, children, the elderly, as well as people with disabilities. So these are exactly how women's rights have been mentioned in this government, the same premier government report 1 year back. Nothing has changed the exact wording. Actually, 2 years back in 2023, when Li Keqiang delivered his last premier's government work report, he said the same thing, but he actually had one little message additional. He also mentioned that the Chinese state will strengthen the protection of women's and children's rights and interests. Obviously, very, very vague wording, right? But I think what this kind of change of wording tells us that from 2023 to 2024, the significance of women's rights actually declined in the Chinese government's work, and nothing has improved since last year. I obviously have more to say. There are one thing, how women are represented in these important assemblies. The second, when they are present, what kind of interests are represented by the female representatives. But we could come back to this later if we have time. But I also find it problematic to group in this wording, to group women together with children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, because it suggests that women as a group, they are inherently vulnerable and forever needs special protection, right? Similar to these other groups. This framing really, I think, does not recognize women as individuals with their agency. So why does this bother me? That was because Xi Jinping proposed this coming global summit on women, and he framed it as we could celebrate the 30th anniversary of the 1995 World Women's Conference held in Beijing. So I just want to take our memories back to 30 years ago, or a little bit over 30 years ago. So in the lead up to the previous important summit, what happened was we actually saw the Chinese Communist Party state really showcased the progress it had made in this era, advancing women's interests and rights, right? We saw the gender quota system, very limited, but it was introduced in governments and actually party committees at provincial level and below. And we saw Wu Yi put forward as the poster girl of China's women's improved political status. We also saw this important conference leading to China's anti-domestic violence legislation, right? But then this kind of substantive commitment has simply been missing recently, right? Today, in the talking of the summit of the new summit of women's rights, what does the Chinese state talks about? They talk about women's employment in the new sectors, coming back to our previous discussion of employment. So not in the tech sector, but women can set up their own petty businesses. They can actually be like this delivery service people, this kind of thing. The Chinese state talks about poverty alleviation of the female population, increased life expectancy of the female population, reduced maternal maternal mortality rate, these kind of things. They are all commendable, but I think in my views, as someone whose research focuses on this very issue of women's rights, I find it highly problematic because there's no policy initiatives or any mentioning of this to improve women's political representation and leadership, which we saw 30 years back. That's, I think I stop here.
Yeah, that is really the point you make about women not being matched against men, but being matched with children, the elderly, and the disabled shows you exactly where the thinking is coming from, that it's not women's equality or women's advancement relative to other adult men. It's as a sort of a group that are inherently vulnerable or weak and therefore need protection. And I think, I think most women like yourself and I, we just want a fair suck of the sav, as they say in Australia. We just want a fair go. I also think it would be really, I don't know if you have any views on this, that the global summit, to what extent will it be the promotion of a version of the domesticated woman? Like, you can quickly solve your unemployment problem by forcing women back into the domestic sphere, by eulogizing domestic work. And we know that, Chinese women are voting with their feet in huge numbers and not marrying and not reproducing, even if they do marry. So what do you think the global summit, will it be a peon to the housewife, or which no disrespect intended to the housewife, but it doesn't give you will they pay housework for housework, which is really weird. Well, I'd like to see that.
Right. I wondered about this. I looked up all I could find about this upcoming Global Women's Summit. Then I found this interview with the deputy chair of the All China Women's Federation, Huang Xiaowei, and she talked about the significance of this upcoming Global Summit on Women, and she talked about what kind of role China could play globally to set an example of advancing women's interest. Then this interview ended with one sentence, which I think is very revealing. She said, if the state could protect women's rights, it means that it could ensure a rapid development of the economy. It could ensure stable familial as well as social relationship. Right. I don't think this is anything new. The advancement of women's rights always serves some other goals.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Watch this space. I certainly will be, and I know you will. We will be
Yes.
eagle-eyed on this topic. And look, one other question I'd like to ask you, which came up in our discussion before the commencement of this session, is another technology that China is exploring, and that came up in the two sessions: traditional Chinese medicine. What was the mention? How does this get captured in the new productive forces or new high quality development, or is it a harking back to history? How did TCM fit into this? Because that's really fascinating.
I keep noticing this very brief mentioning of things that stand out. So TCM was mentioned also with one sentence in the government report, which was a part of the 2025 main goals, which says we will refine the mechanisms for the preservation and innovative development of traditional Chinese medicine and promote high quality development of traditional Chinese medicine programs and industries. So this probably doesn't make too much sense, and also it's very brave, but I think it actually sends a very strong signal to myself, who is a new researcher on traditional Chinese medicine, as well as a lot of stakeholders that's actually all in some ways related to the development and promotion of traditional Chinese medicine. We are talking about actually a lot of what we were saying just now: local governments, private businesses, a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, which are private, but there are also state-owned large ones. There are TCM research institutions, universities, TCM hospitals. Everybody seems to be so excited by this one very short mentioning in the Premier's government work report. So another side of the two sessions is all these delegates and representatives actually get together. They meet for about a week every day, and they talk about their ideas, policy proposals, so on and so forth. So these people actually paid a lot of attention to this one sentence. They expressed a lot of enthusiasm because everybody saw an opportunity coming up. So I want to interpret this language for everybody here a little bit, right? The preservation of traditional Chinese medicine really talks about maintaining and passing on the knowledge, practices, theory of traditional Chinese medicine that had been developed over the many, many years, right? As such, TCM is to be promoted as a part of the Chinese culture, as well as China's historical heritage. That's one side of the story. Last year, when TCM was mentioned, it was promoted as a part of the Chinese medical system. It still is, but now it's phrased as also as industries. So there is this potential of economic interest to be unleashed. And all these major stakeholders see this opportunity. Obviously, this is not new, right? It has been mentioned since Xi Jinping came to power. There have been a lot of important documents issued by the central state on TCM, including TCM actually featured in the 14th five-year plan. And following the 14th five-year plan, the State Council actually released its own traditional Chinese medicine 14th five-year plan. So the state's idea is traditional Chinese medicine is, I think, a bit of everything, right? It is this cultural heritage, very important as a part of China's nation building, right? To promote traditional Chinese medicine as to promote Chinese culture, Chinese history, and also this shared identity based on this culture and history. Then is a part of the Chinese medical and healthcare system because it's cheaper than Western medical treatments and practices, and also is well accepted, or at least by a part of the population, not everybody. It's a very dividing issue to talk about traditional Chinese medicine in China. Then it's the industry. It's not just one industry. This central government plans has been very creative when talking about traditional Chinese medicine. The central government does not just see it as the production of ingredients, manufacturing of the medicines. They actually see there could be a kind of a tourist sector set up around traditional Chinese medicine. There could be online games themed of traditional Chinese medicine, these kind of things. So I think another space for us to watch, I think,
Yeah, okay.
over this year.
Really online games with TCM, but I'd also interested to hear that TCM's a contested topic within China, you know, and maybe there's some big pharma out there in outside of China, or even herbal practitioners outside of China who'd be very interested to hear about this opportunity that might be arising from forward-thinking, forward-moving policies in China. Tony, you've got your hand up. Please dive in.
Oh, it was just a couple of things really in support of Minglu's first point. And the first is just to look at the Chinese government's treatment of the Me Too movement in China. I think, makes it pretty evident what the attitude is. And perhaps, in a sense, even more importantly, was at the All China Women's Congress, the keynote speaker was Xi Jinping. And it's probably worth reading his speech to at least understand his opinion of what the role of women is. And it was very much what you might call it, a very traditional view from the Communist Party's perspective of the role of women, which very much was, breed children for me because we've got a demographic problem, and be good, obedient wives. I mean, that's in some sense was boiling down pretty much his message. So I think Minglu is absolutely on the ball with the comments that she was making there. And as you said, I mean, lumping women together as a category with those suffering from disabilities and others, what does that mean? It's crazy.
Well, having a womb's always been considered a bit of a disability, so we're used to it, and we just know we're inherently superior anyway, don't we, Minglu? Anyway, Michael, can I give you? We've got a couple more minutes before we open to questions, so I give the panelists a chance to have a last few words, please do put your questions into the chat, and I'll try and get through as many of them as I can, either grouping them together and throwing them back to the panel. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, Michael, do you have anything, thoughts to add on anything you've heard before from the other panelists?
Not in particular. I just wanted to thank Minglu for bringing up topics that are often underappreciated and understudied and underdiscussed. As was mentioning that, you know, they mentioned women in it, but nobody talked about it in the media at all. But believe me, there was plenty talking about 5G and AI. So my area, of course, is, you know, whipped and beaten, but her area is underappreciated. But I think that this raises a very interesting perspective on the role of the private sector and this idea of maybe not that they expect everyone to get jobs in the high quality, high tech sector, but they do, I believe, there is a strong desire to reinvigorate some of the palpable entrepreneurial energy that I first felt when I first moved to China. This idea that every young person is, whether they're working in a 9-to-5 job in a state-owned company or they're scraping by doing delivery, everybody's just waiting to start their own business. This idea of going back to where everybody wants to become an entrepreneur, because a lot of that passion seems to have cooled in recent years. And one of the hopes, I think, is, and I even saw this back during COVID, was when they started reallowing petty street vendors in Shanghai, which have been very effectively swept under the rug for a number of years. This idea that petty entrepreneurship is a necessary vow for creating employment and creating opportunities, as well as creating a sense that anyone can be their own boss, anybody can be an entrepreneur, even though it's obviously there is somewhat limited financial opportunities therein. But there is a desire to bring the private sector back in, if nothing else, but just to act as an engine for creating new employment and a perception of self-efficacy in the young population in particular.